the geopolitical tensions made quite abundantly aware that as soon as you don't have your own technology stack and you're depending on a friendly nation like the US, things can change very quickly. And your consumption, instead of owning technology stack yourself, makes it very hard to negotiate economical deals or basically anything with for instance, the United States when it comes to technology. We don't have anything to put against it. And I think that's a real shame. And I think we as Europe should be more pushing towards having our own AI infrastructure in place, building our own models, and making sure we're not depending on anyone for this. So if we want to keep our prosperity up to the level that we have today, then this is something we need to invest in quite rapidly.
Welcome to AI Catch Up, the podcast catching up with the tech products that matter in the AI era.
Hi everyone, welcome to the AI Catch Up podcast. My name is Elina and I'm your host. Today I'm joined by Arnold Juffer and he is the CEO and founder of Nebul. Nebul is dealing with the topics around European sovereignty, private cloud and private GPTs. The company is also targeting the goal of providing 100% secure alternative to ChatGPT and DeepSeek. And that is why I'm super excited to talk to Arnold today. Arnold, welcome to AI Catch Up.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Private cloud is something that I have not discussed with my customers. When they are from the space of healthcare, when they are from the space of finance, the topic of on-premises or private clouds has been popping up very often. However, recently, the topic of sovereignty from hyperscalers has gotten even a bit of a more interesting flavor. And on KubeCon in Europe, exactly this April, the big discussion was around geopolitical issues and also the topics of how we should think about the sovereignty of the data and in the future also the sovereignty of AI workflows that will be going into the production. That is why the question is to you on how you have started approaching the topic of private cloud and private AI.
That's a good question. I think at Nebul, we're really focused on building what's missing in AI and the cloud space. So we think full sovereignty and full compliance, real usability for enterprises that care about where their data lives and how it's used is missing. So what we've built isn't just a European alternative to public AI or cloud. It's a new kind of infrastructure, one that's more private by design and secure by default, built for regulated industries and enterprises that value ownership of their data. So we're turning compliance into a competitive advantage. I think it's become very important in this time of global tension.
Yeah, and if I would double down on the compliance as a competitive advantage, which industries and which companies do you think are benefiting the most from working with you and generally considering that, well, I should be in my own sovereign place?
And we think that's true for most companies. So most enterprises value their intellectual property and their sensitive data. That's basically what differs them from the competition. So I always say bringing all that data and IP to something shared based in the US isn't a great idea. So from my standpoint, every company should care about where that data resides. But on the other hand, we also see companies that find themselves in the regulated data space. So healthcare, local governments, central governments, legal, finance, right? They're bound by compliance restrictions, sometimes very harsh if you go into healthcare, for instance, but that's also something we want, right? So I think Europeans are different in terms of values, on their values for privacy and sovereignty. And we don't always act according to those values, but like you just said, the change of wind or the change of times has really made a difference in that.
Yeah. I understand, and at the same time, it's very interesting how compliance is helping companies match the deeper needs of its users?
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. So what you see is that there are a lot of companies that are already doing a lot to secure their data and make sure that their customer information or their intellectual property is secure and private, not being shared with others or in control of other parties. That's the second problem, obviously, with compliance. And if you look at GDPR, especially, It's not just having a private environment, it's also who's controlling that environment, who can access that environment. And if you have strong legislation in place like the US has with FISA and the US Cloud Act, you can be secure and private today. But if the US government wants to access your data, they're just one click away, right? So they can ask Microsoft, AWS, or Google to open up the data, and they need to adhere to that American legislation, obviously. So there's the conflict. And I think people and companies are looking for trust, and compliance can provide that trust. So if we make sure that we have the right legislation in place and the right set of values converted into policies or laws, that would really help us create boundaries within we can innovate much quicker. So I don't see privacy or compliance as bad or a restrictor. If you build the right infrastructure and you take a by design or by default approach to security and privacy, it's really easy to get compliant and to innovate within that boundaries.
The US Cloud Act, or FISA, those regulations can oblige European companies and all other companies to provide the data about the users. From your experience, what were the things that you have seen with the customers? In what situations they have struggled with the US Cloud Act?
Most companies, if you take commercial companies, what we see is that they don't really struggle with that. So compliance is, for the most commercial companies, not the biggest issue. Privacy is. And that's why I always divide those two, because the compliance part is mostly important for regulated data companies, right? But if you are in healthcare, biotech, government, then you have specific knowledge about all your patients, inhabitants, or civilians. So you have a lot of data from people, and that personal data is something that needs to be protected by laws, and companies need to comply to that. So that's the big struggle if you look at those laws versus compliance. And like I said, most public clouds run their infrastructure in a shared fashion. So they have shared control planes, shared models, shared everything. And companies need to decide if they want to protect their sensitive data or their sensitive IP, if they want to put that in a shared environment where they do not control who has access, where they do not control what's happening to the data. And if companies are fine with that, right? If enterprises are fine with another company having that control by saying, well, Microsoft is a very trustworthy company, or AWS or Google, then it's fine, right? Then it's not a problem for them. But we see a lot of companies that think differently about the topic. So we see both. And it differs per country. That's also very good to state. I think if you look at the somewhat smaller countries in Europe, they are used to adopting to technology stacks that are not their own. So if you take Holland or Denmark, we both are used to using technology platforms from abroad. You see that in a much wider adoption of public cloud, for instance. The Dutch government has a almost 80% conversion rate to public cloud, where you see that for instance, the German market is way more conservative, and your privacy laws are also much more stringent with the Datenschutz part of that. But it's much more alive in Germany to be private and not controlled from abroad.
Yeah, I understand what you mean with those geographical differences. And I think that one of the funniest conversations I have had about the cloud was actually with a Dutch policeman who was, well, indeed discussing cloud applications with me, because that is something that he could have done. Now you're bringing up an interesting aspect, especially when we think about machine learning and the EL development, because it is obviously different in different countries. You are very actively in all the public information stating that, well, no shared American operators and no American control is being present in Nebul. How do you ensure this? And how do you look into the topic of open weights and the models that we are getting from US or from China? I have seen Quen recently being published and supported on Nebul, but how do you ensure the privacy in those cases?
Yeah, that's a good point, because you see a lot of misunderstanding on this topic. So if you take, for instance, the Chinese model, DeepSeek, it's basically a model which has been built in China. But if you ship it to Europe and you run it in a European data center on European servers and clouds, then there's no real risk of your data leaking out. So the model itself is not leaking any data or sharing any data with a foreign power. So it's absolutely important that you run, and that's where GDPR also comes in, that you run your AI models in an infrastructure that is European owned, European operated, and located in Europe. And in our case, we run an open source software stack on top of it instead of proprietary US software, as we have no US parent company and no cross-border management APIs or anything. Everything from the GPU layer to the service orchestration is under European legal jurisdiction and operational control. So that's what we mean by no shared American operators or control. And if you run the models that way and you create a separate data set within a private cloud and you connect the AI models to that data, then that data is not being shared outside of your control.
However, was the view on DeepSeek. The model has been bombarded with the questions about Chinese party. And what I very often see is the sentiment towards saying that DeepSeek is bringing the propaganda of the Chinese party to the responses it is giving. Because what you have currently highlighted is that if we are hosting Chinese model on our own server, then our data is staying with us and is not leaving Europe.
Yes.
But what do you think about the aspect of training and potentially also the data sanitization with different views on the political regimes or on different cultural aspects?
Yes, that's another part, right? So the bias of the model, is it the model will answer where it's trained on. If the model itself is trained in China, it's probably trained on Chinese data, and there's a different bias than here in Europe or in the US. Normally, those models come out quite balanced because the amount of data that is being used is huge. So it's very hard to control the bias in a model. That's why we need guardrails, for instance, to put those models within boundaries as in terms of their output. But you're right that a model can have a bias. For instance, talk more positively about China than a US or European model would do. And that's something you need to take into account. But that says a little bit more of how accurate or trustworthy the answers are from the model, and then it would say about data privacy or compliance. So it's a real different topic.
Yeah, model bias, exactly. A challenging one.
Yeah. Maybe to add to that, so hallucination, it's something that also comes from the models, right? So it's a topic that also is quite often in the conversation. We think that adding RAG, for instance, to models is one very, very powerful way of making sure that bias or hallucination drops dramatically. You can give the AI model specific information on your company data or on specific data sets and improve the outcomes of the model dramatically. So it's also not just the model itself, but it's also the way you deploy the model or models. So for a lot of applications, we see multiple models being used. One model controls or checks out the other model. The models are used to improve their answering and create a much better context about the business you are running and in which the question is asked. So there are a lot of ways to optimize the output of the model. And for instance, DeepSeek is, if you look around, still one of the most used and preferred models in many, many AI applications.
It has been definitely a wow effect in the AI industry.
Yes.
What's your view and maybe hope, maybe sentiment towards thinking about European LM providers? Do you think we need more? Do you think
Yes.
we should? Okay.
This is quite the topic. So what I really think is that we are falling behind in the AI race. People can like it or not, but the AI is some sort of an arms race. I think that to be relevant in a global play field, Europe needs to make sure that it has its own sovereign and dedicated infrastructure. And not just that, also build their own models on top of it. So we are not depending on other countries to do it for us. I think what the geopolitical pressures or tensions made quite abundantly aware that as soon as you don't have your own technology stack and you're depending on a friendly nation like the US, things can change very quickly. And your consumption, instead of owning technology stack yourself, it makes it very hard to negotiate economical deals or well, basically anything with, for instance, the United States when it comes to technology. We don't have anything to put against it, and I think that's a real shame. And we, as Europe, should be more pushing towards having our own AI infrastructure in place, building our own models, and making sure we're not depending on anyone for this. So we keep control of what we love here in Europe. So I think it's really elemental to economic success in the future. If we want to keep our prosperity up to the level that we have today, then this is something we need to invest in quite rapidly.
I can see that the budgets for research and for educational institutions in Europe is not that far behind from the US.
No.
At the same time, what we can see was the available model providers. Sometimes what I can also hear is that exactly the European regulation is something that is stifling the development of these model providers. What is your take on this? What exactly is blocking us from building the... I would be very happy if I could create a funny name for DeepSeek that would have a certain European connotation, but I can't. So Deep Europe, let's call it like that for now. Why don't we have Deep Europe?
There are multiple causes for that. So one is we have a very different investment profile than the US. I always say if we talk to American investors, they are believers in an idea or in a future or in a promise. And if they see that promise and future, they accept or believe that there's a market for it, they will invest in it and they will go. And that's what you see in the US in the last years already. And that's why they have the advantage. So there's appetite for risk in investment. If you go to Europe, that's a whole different story. I always say the European investors are mostly bankers, and bankers look at things very differently. So they look at risk, they look at cash flow. First, they want the customers to be there. And then if the customer is there, they might invest in a platform like ours, right? And that's a very different approach. I always call it chicken and egg. The egg was first, right? Without the egg, no chicken. And that's a very large difference that you see with the US. And that's why the US has been much more successful in AI until this point. The second one is that we lack the innovation power, it seems, and it could be that things like the AI Act are not really helping. The bigger models, multimodal models, we are not able, or we can't really deploy them. We can do DeepSeek size models, but if you take, for instance, the new Llama 4, it's too big and also blocked the model for being used in Europe. And that's something they did also to prevent them getting fined by the European Union. So I really think I know that you want to constrain the AI development, but it's being done from a non-technical view, I think. So it's very much with a legal starting point, and I don't think legal people without knowledge of AI are the best to put legislation in place. And I think the AI Act, if I look at it now, I think, well, we could have done a better job on this. I think it's very much limiting AI development in Europe. We should do better. And the third one is that, like the US, if you take, for instance, governments, the US government, it supports their cloud infrastructure parties. So most big US clouds have some sort of contract with the US government, could be Fed Cloud or anything, something like that. And they basically block everything that is not US. And then in Europe, we do it differently. So we give out those large sums of money by the European Union, but we make it very hard to use those sums of money. There's always so much constraints surrounding these grants and budgets that no commercial company is really using it. So we get stuck somewhere in the middle. So the money is there, it goes to think tanks, it goes to research centers, but it doesn't convert into a real technology stack. And if you look at where we are today as Europe, we're missing out the big hyperscale clouds. We don't have anything to put up against the Americans on that way and on that side. We're not building models, right? So there's just a Mistral. So that's the most successful European model builder, but not on the scale that is happening in the US. So even if we're putting in some sort of money or promises for money, it's not converting, right? The technology stack isn't there. And especially if you look at cloud, we're certainly 4 or 5 years behind if we are ever going to catch up to them, because then we need a mental change in Europe to stop using US clouds as a first option and start using European clouds as a first option. Like I said, US government is doing that already, right? For many services they tender out. I think the European or the EU, our European governments should facilitate innovation, should facilitate technology development, not try to do it themselves. That's what you also see, right? They're building AI factories. I think the market can do that very well. I think the government should facilitate, legislate, but with a practical approach to it, as in there's also something that we need to achieve, not just legislate.
Would you mind sharing your own experience? Because you need compliance with the EU Act yourself. So how much time, how much effort, what is the investment like for you to actually, make it happen? And on the problematic parts, you would be probably asking for some changes to the regulations. So what
Yeah.
could those ones be?
Well, the European AI Act, it's a very complex beast, so it's very hard to know specifically when you're in the clear and when you're not. What you see is, especially on the side of transparency and the ability to follow every idea answer that the AI had or has given, that makes it very hard. So if you want full traceability, that is a huge administrative task. And it's like I always say, it's a little bit same like if you ask a person a question and then you ask them where they got that knowledge from, how they could answer that question. I would like to know in which grade of elementary school somebody taught you to do math, right? So it's basically that's one of the questions we ask. AI should always be capable of providing those answers. This response I gave to you to a question, the data that we use to create that answer, or the training parts that we use to create that answer, are from A, B, or C. So that's I think the most problematic part of the AI Act.
So what you're referring to is more of the wish for model cards and the data sources to be more clearly
No,
described?
traceability. So traceability of where the answer is coming from. So basically, if you build an AI model or an AI application and you have users and those users ask questions, you should be able, as provider of that application, you should be able to give the user a traceable log of where that answer is coming from. And that's basically such a big administrative. It's undoable because many times you cannot trace back where the answer is coming from. If it's coming from the model itself, it's very hard to provide that insight where the answer is coming from. You could do it with RAG quite easily, right? So you could say the answer is also coming from this data source or that data source, and you can link back to that. But having full traceability of the answers is very hard. But it's basically mandated in the AI Act. So that's something that's quite frankly very hard to adhere to technically. And the second part is that the models are limited in size. From the AI Act, we have a limitation on how big a model can be, how many different capabilities could be in there, right? So multimodal models are basically prohibited of being used. So if you look at it that way, the AI Act is not really helping the development of AI applications and models in Europe.
Yep, definitely. And with regards to traceability, would you say that the recent trend of reasoning and the chain of thought that is currently visible to the user is something that would count for the trace log?
No, because it just provides you insight into how the model has come to its answer in terms of the reasoning part, but it doesn't give you the answer as into where every expert or agent got that information from, or the model got that information from. And that's also basically one of the problems. It's very hard to interpret, as in, am I doing it right now, or is this wrong? And the most legal people I talk to say, well, this is just the first version of the AI Act. There's no real full control on it, right, or full check on it. And we need to go to maybe a version 2 and a version 3, as we did with GDPR. to get it into better shape. So it's a process. It's not done yet. This is the first one. And I think they're right about that. But I also think it's too controlling and it limits what we're doing in the AI realm.
Yep. The challenging discussion was any lawyers, that's for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
If we would come back to willingness to make more European innovation, and we would take one specific example of, let's say middle-sized company.
Yeah.
And you are talking to the business owner of the company who is thinking that, well, I know that my developers have Googled stuff, they have experimented with that, and I know that all the tools are from the US. So what benefits this business owner could expect from working with Nebul, thinking about sovereignty, and what particular steps you would recommend this person to take to ensure, well, the alignment with European values in whatever form we currently can represent them in the technical domain?
That's a big question. There's a lot of parts in that. So let's start with the tools, right? Using those tools. It doesn't really matter where those tools come from, I think, as long as they're open source. So we have a big bias for open source because we think it's critical for sovereignty. So proprietary models, especially when they're API bound, they're black boxes. So you don't know what's being logged, you don't know what's being cached, you don't know who can access the context of that tool or API. And I think if you use open source, you can have full control over your tool set, over your models, over your inference pipelines. So I think using open source solves most of the problems. And then it doesn't really matter where it comes from, right? So if it's from the US or from China or from Europe, if you have a very good open source tool and it's vetted, and that vetting is also very important, that it's not full of leaks or hacks or backdoors. But if it's a vetted tool, you should be able to use it without any problem. And again, they only get problematic when they're not run in Europe, so and under control of a European company. That's what's the problem, not especially where the code is being created. I think that's the biggest advantage, that you are able to control that and guard yourself from those things. Can everybody do that? No. So you need to have the right team in place, and I think that's something that where we work on to make sure that we use open source software that doesn't do those things. And if they do, we tend to have a sandbox deployment. So you always run isolated on your own GPUs, and we ensure that no telemetry or upstream sharing is or phoning home is in place. That's basically the principles we use to build and deploy tools.
So if I'm thinking about the competitive advantages,
yeah.
What do you think are the AI capabilities where this business owner should see the moat, the business moat, and where this person can pretty much rely on anything available in the field, especially with the view on the limited choice of the tools that are compliant with European regulations? And you have just mentioned the example with multimodal models, right? So if I would be thinking about the availability of those ones on the open source field, then there are way less. If I'm thinking about the models that are able to do deep research, pretty much similar thing.
Yeah. Yeah. So is there a big difference between the proprietary and the open source solutions? Yes, I think so. Mostly open source is somewhat of a part of something bigger that you're building, right? That's where we most often use the open source platforms for. And what you see is as soon as you go to the more proprietary solutions, it's a boxed product, right? So in terms of business mode, I even think that open source is more powerful because it enables you to build something of your own, right? So you can build basically tailored solutions more easily without the lock-in of proprietary solutions. And there's also less dependency on those solutions. So you can basically control the technology stack, but you need to be a company that is able or capable of building those solutions and checking that technology stack. And in terms of the business mode, I think that any company that doesn't start using AI today will be in deep trouble 2, 3 years down the road. Do AI solutions deliver value today? For some companies, they already do a lot. And for others, it's just in the experimenting phase and they're losing maybe even money on it. Things go well and things go wrong. But that experimentation part is very, very important because you want to make sure that you learn how to use AI and learn to understand where you can use it and can't use it. And in the end, I think the open source approach is the most protective of what makes you as a company. So what differentiates you from others. And I think there's real value in building AI applications today, experimenting with it and maturing those applications into agents or agentive workflows that are being used shortly or in the near future, which helps you um, capitalize on your company data. They help you accelerate your workforce and in some cases even replace your workforce because that's, for instance, easy repetitive work that can easily be done by an AI agent. Is that always good? I don't know. I do think that this is something that's going to happen anyway. And if you don't make sure that you have that in place too, then you will move yourself out of the competitive position. So AI is here and it's here to stay. It will grow very quickly into something much more mature than it is today. It's not going to be there in 6 to 12 months, but it's going very, very quickly. And those who adapt will be in a much better competitive position tomorrow. But you also need to take into account that using those systems and models and tools have risks, especially on your intellectual property and your sensitive data. And I think you can build solutions taking notice of both, right? Taking both into account. Did that answer your question? Yeah.
I would also repeat what you have just said, because you have said something extremely interesting, and that was namely that AI is making your company what it is, or is making it special, it's making it differentiable. And I do fully see what you mean by that, because if you are diving deep into customer behavior, if you're diving deep into your internal operations, with the power of big data that is being analyzed by AI, that is bringing you to the point of very much data-driven decision making, and also the criteria will still be decided by certain people who are deciding in the space. And that is why it will be giving the vision, it will be showing interesting vectors of development. I really like
Absolutely.
that.
Yes. Yes, absolutely.
I would be also very curious to understand whether there is something behind your general company strategy was focusing on B2B. Is it just because in the quotation marks, the American market is more used to B2C products and consumption that is generally oriented towards individuals? Or have you just been working more on the B2B side and that is why you have decided to go there? Are you considering that each and every European should have their own Nebul chat in their devices? What is your take on B2B?
We don't have B2C plans today. So we started out with the perception of adding company data to AI. So we have a very strong data and AI integration focus, and that's basically a business play. So that's where we focus on business to business first, and the other part is while we're developing products, if you go into business to consumer versus business to business, as you might know, if you're in a building curve, it's much easier to work with enterprises that have specific goals than to deliver a customer product that is being used by consumers. Will need to have everything in place to support those consumers in a in the right way. So you either have a very mature product or you have a very good customer service. And the phase where we are in, it makes much more sense to service the business to business market at this point. So our product is built for that, and I think the organization from us as a our organization is also better equipped to service the enterprise market. But it doesn't mean that we're not going to do that. I think we need to have a much more mature product if we ever want to move into the consumer market.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. your willingness to actually serve the product in its birth state. It's something that I not always, like the things that I don't always observe from the well-known B2C products. But yeah, everyone is having their own boundary and threshold on releasing something or not releasing something.
Yes. And if you look at, for instance, OpenAI has been, right, the world got to know OpenAI at version 3.5, right? So I always say, so they had they've done a lot of development and then a lot of testing before. And even when 3.5 came out and it became a huge success, you saw that their whole operational model went down the tube, right? The success and speed of scaling was so high that their systems were just not built for this. And that's what we also take into account. So we know that we also have to be in a maturity version 3 or something before you really spread it out across the market. And we're working very hard on that. We just released our version 2. It's a very mature product, but it's an enterprise product at this stage, very much focused on delivering value with RAG. And that's not something that a consumer would normally use, right? So even though Perplexity is also, that's one of the competitors of ChatGPT, that's also very heavily working with RAG, but we're much focused on connecting to private data instead of public data. Yeah. So.
Yeah. And as the person who is probably applying AI not only to the services of the clients, but also internally, what would you say were the interesting or unexpected to you as the company founder findings when it comes to optimizing processes with AI agents, looking more into what processes and what tasks and what roles are running? Has there been one interesting or maybe several insights into the operations?
Yes, internally. So yeah, I think one of the most important things is for instance, the operations of our cloud systems. Sometimes I tell the sheer number of logs, for instance, that cloud systems generate. There's so much data coming from so many angles. Traditionally, we used systems to basically backtrace what went wrong, if something went wrong. And then from all those logs, you can see, well, this is what happened. And we're now using AI agents to analyze that data and make it more predictive, but also to generate outcomes or patterns that a human wouldn't recognize, right? So that's very simple, but it's the starting point for us to make sure that many of the operations within the data center are run by an AI agent instead of um, uh, by a real person. And that's a big plus because if you have the very capable engineers in your team, that's not the work they want to be doing, and it's a 24/7 job, right? So being able to put much of that work into the hands of an AI, very, very powerful. And we also see things change in terms of we're so much used to having an interface. And I always say this to my customers too. We're so much used to using interfaces. I always say the most SaaS products are basically HTML wrappers around a database with fixed procedures and settings. And what you will also see is most companies have large data sets with historical data, which is very, very valuable, but it doesn't come back into those applications. So people are always trying to find stuff and combining information. Application A has a manual in a Word document, which is stored somewhere else. So having an AI as an assistant is very, very powerful. And I think if you look at the next generation AI, I think it's going to replace many of the front ends of those applications. Because why? You all see it already happening with Google, right? Search is going down dramatically. People are starting to use an AI as a search engine. And it's so easy to make the next step but if it's not only search, I want you to do this, or I want you to do that, or I need this information from an application or a data set. AI will become the interface between the human and all the data and process behind that. So I think it's going to be a primary interface for many of the business processes and other processes we have in our companies. Absolutely.
Two wonderful use cases. So with infrastructure maintenance and also with the interfaces, I can fully grasp why you think that those are good ones to use. How have you approached all the different types of customers that might be interested in the private cloud, and how you decided on working with them at Nebul? And what can be the good place for people to start reading through or listening when it comes to running private AI workloads?
Yeah, and we have a white paper on how to get started. So I think
Oh yeah, that's great.
yeah,
That's great.
yeah, yeah. So what we see a lot of companies struggling with, everybody knows they want to use AI. Everybody who has a nose for business understands that AI will be a dramatic game changer. And they all want to start with it, but they don't know where to start. And if you look at the playing fields, what I see is that on the one hand you have the large infrastructure suppliers. They sell you GPUs. I can fully understand if you're a business owner that you think, what do I need to do with a GPU, right? It's very complex, moving parts, doing all the technology stuff. I need a full team to make that happen. And on the other side, you have model builders that put, say, layers on top of those GPUs. And then in the last part, you have the application builders who make something that you can consume quite easily. And what we've done at Nebul is that we basically created an approach for all three parts. So it depends on what you want to do. Is it something that you want to consume quite easily? Then we have our GPT. If you have enterprise applications or large data sets and you want to tap into that, then we have RAG and we have AI models, which you can consume quite simply as an API, but under your control. And the third one is the superclusters. And those superclusters are for the brave ones who do their own model training. That's so, and you need to have those three layers in place to be able to help customers on their way. And then we created a process on top of that where we say, well, we're going to start out with a workshop with our customers. We're going to decide on if there's a problem or a very large opportunity that we can fix with AI in the company. And then we're going to build something with the customer in a fixed time period. So you decide on this is the problem. We're going to build something as an MVP, minimum viable product. And we're going to do it in 2 or 3 months, depending on how big the problem is. And then we're going to see after that 3 months what the value is. So you take out the risk and you give them a starting point and you give them a single topic to focus on or a single outcome to focus on, and you work towards that goal and you keep it simple and constrained in time and cost, and that takes the risk out. And if you do those processes, and we did a lot of them in the past year, you always see the switch going. You see the switch moving from one side to the other side of the table mostly, and people start to see the light of what AI can do and what it can bring, and also what it can do. And because there's a lot of limitations still to what AI can do. So yeah, and I think we created a nice process around that, helping customers getting through those first steps, which are very hard to do for most companies at this point.
Arnold, that has been very insightful. And at the same time, I'm pretty sure that some of our listeners would be glad to continue the conversation, at least on the asynchronous level, and then
Yeah.
also to dive deep into something. So would you recommend them something to go through when they are willing to start on considering private cloud and private AI for themselves?
Yeah, I would consider them to go through our website. So there's a lot of information on the process that I just explained to you, as in the steps you can take. There's a lot of information on the products we provide and the compliance and privacy approach that we take. And there's a form in there which you can fill out if you want to get in touch and have a conversation with us on any topic related to AI and cloud. So yeah, we're very happy to have that conversation.
Sounds great. Thanks a lot for your time.
Thank you very much for having me. It was a pleasure.